Quick pause. We expanded to YouTube because we keep hearing, I needed this 20 years ago. And the next generation shouldn't have to wait. So tell the young women in your world who are scrolling and watching to subscribe to This Is Woman's Work on YouTube. I am Nicole Khalil, and you're listening to the This Is Woman's Work podcast. We're together. We're redefining what it means, what it looks and feels like to be doing women's work in the world today. And if you're a regular listener, you know that redefining women's work and building women's confidence are deeply linked for me. I've spent years trying to figure out what actually builds our confidence and what destroys it. I was tired of the empty advice like, just be confident or fake it till you make it, or the almost universal suggestion that the way we become confident is by looking confident first. So I researched, studied, observed, and identified 5 confidence builders. But one of the 5 took me a really long time to identify and an even longer time to accept, and that's failure. That thing that we've been taught to avoid at all costs, that we wrap in shame or embarrassment and silence. But I've come to understand that failure and fear and doubt and all the things that make us feel like we're falling apart are the very experiences that make us stronger, more human, and ultimately more confident. Because it's not perfection that builds firm and bold trust in self. It's the failure and the recovery. It's getting back up after you've been knocked down, dusting yourself off, and getting back into action towards what matters most. As our guest today points out, like waves, we rise. Beautiful, powerful, full of momentum, and we also crash. We hit the shore, the wall, our limit. And for most of us, that breaking feels like failure, like something to hide, fix, or feel shame about. But what if the break isn't the problem? What if it's the point? What if every collapse, every loss, every unraveling is actually the moment when we meet what's real? The point where perfection ends and authenticity begins, because the breaking doesn't destroy us, it reveals us. Our guest today, Chen, knows this journey well. She's the co-founder of Embrace Global, a nonprofit that's helped save over 1 million premature babies with its groundbreaking portable incubator. She's been recognized by President Obama, funded by Beyonce, and featured in the New York Times, Forbes, and Newsweek. Her memoir, Like a Wave, We Break, explores what happens when our success shatters and how that breaking can become the beginning of something truer, deeper, and more whole. So, Jane, welcome to the show. And because we don't often get to hear people talk about their challenges, obstacles, and failures out loud, I'd love to start there. Can you share a little bit about losing Embrace and how it forced you to reevaluate, I'm sure, very many things, but also who you are?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me, Nicole. Embrace started when I was a graduate school student at Stanford. I was doing my MBA at the time, and I took a course there that was all about creating low-cost technologies for people living on less than $1 a day. So I got with a team of graduate students, and we invented this technology that it was an incubator to help the 15 million preterm and underweight babies born every year around the world, many of whom live in remote parts of the world and have families who can't access stable electricity. And so we ended up creating a technology that was portable, that could work without constant electricity and cost just a fraction of the cost of a traditional incubator. And so with that, once we graduated, we turned this into a company. I moved to India for the next 4 years, where over 40% of the world's preterm and underweight babies are born. And I just poured myself into the work. I made the work my life. And so it was something I cared about so deeply, and we could dive into why. I started to unpack what was driving me much later on, but that work consumed me. And so I was working 80 to 100-hour weeks. I never took a weekend off, and I worked like that for many years. I lived in India for 4 years, moved back to the US, and just kept pushing, even though I knew I was exhausted. Meanwhile, we were facing countless setbacks doing this work, from manufacturing to distribution to funding challenges. Like every challenge you could imagine came our way because we were trying to do something very, very difficult here. So 10 years in, we had to shut down the company. And that felt like the ultimate failure, right? This thing I'd poured my soul into for a decade shut down. And I didn't know who I was anymore. My whole identity was so wrapped up in my company and my job title, my achievements, that I really didn't know who I was anymore. And so that set me off on a healing journey, right? And I felt like it was a matter of survival at that point because I was like hanging off of a cliff.
Mhm.
That's what it felt like. And through that healing journey, and we can dive into that a little bit more later, but I started confronting some really challenging things that I hadn't looked at carefully before. Namely, that I had grown up with domestic violence. And I hadn't connected the dots until that point that feeling so powerless throughout my childhood, that's what had driven me to help the most powerless people in the world. Had given me that fuel. But it had also driven me to work in such unhealthy ways, right? And again, I felt like, I cared so much about our mission, but I also believed that my worth depended on what I achieved. And so as I did this healing work and it took me years to come out the other side of that, I began to learn self-compassion. And it's interesting because for the longest time, most of my life, I thought resilience meant pushing harder. If I was
Mhm.
tired, I kept going. I didn't take breaks. If something was challenging, I found a way. And through this experience, I learned that actually self-compassion or resilience is about self-compassion.
Yeah.
And you talked earlier about the importance of failure and recovery. Well, when we have this inner sense of self-worth, then we can take risks and fail and get up and brush ourselves off and know that we're gonna be okay because it's not about success or failure. That's not what defines us, right? It's growing in the process.
Right.
And then through that process of experimentation and failure, like, then becoming who we've always meant to be.
Yeah. So you said many things in there that I think we can all relate to, but one of the things I want to hone in on is this thing that I think a lot of us unconsciously feel, and that is that our worth is connected to our achievement, to our results, to our output, to our
Yeah.
accolades, I mean, the list goes on, right? We've sort of outsourced or externalized our worth and our value. And my question is twofold. First, any insight, ideas, tricks, or tips of how you connect to your value and your worth without
Yes.
tying it to all of those things? So let's start there. Any ideas
Yes,
on that?
absolutely. And this is one of the things I talk about often. What I learned is that outcomes can be arbitrary or dictated by things outside of our control, right? Look what happened during the pandemic. Like the world turned upside down and everything went, you're right, nothing went according to plan. And so if we define ourselves by only the external, then our sense of self becomes so fragile. And frankly, I worry with the rise of social media, right? Now
Yeah.
our self-worth is defined by how many likes we get on social media.
Yeah.
And so the way I've learned to separate my worth from the outcome or just the success or the failure is really focusing on what I can control, which are my values, right? So am I acting with love every day? Am I giving to others? Am I growing? These are all things I can control. And so if I'm living my values day in and day out, that is success, not necessarily the outcome itself, right? Which I don't have full control over. And that's not to say don't have goals. Yes, that is important. But even when things don't go your way, it doesn't mean that you've failed. So this is
Mhm.
about redefining success.
Yeah. And I think in that redefining, knowing that failure, challenge, obstacles are part of
Yes.
it, it's not even separate from. I think sometimes we think of them as separate events as opposed to they're completely linked.
Oh my gosh, completely linked. And I think back to that moment when Embrace failed, which was like, it felt like the worst moment of my life.
Mm.
And now I look back and I think, what a gift. What a gift. Because if that hadn't happened, I would not have gone on this healing journey. I would not have learned all the things I needed to learn to become a more grounded, happy person, right? And that frankly led to like the purpose that I now want to devote my life to.
Yeah. Okay. So all of that brings me to the next question, and I'm going to try to frame this in the best way I can. But it's that knowing when to give yourself grace or when to keep pushing, when to start listening or stop resisting. I think we all have experienced this feeling of if we just keep going, if we just stick with it, and there's some truth to that. But then
Yes.
there's also the like, never quit. Okay. But yeah, we should quit when it's not serving us, when it's doing us harm. So I guess my question is when do we know
Mhm.
which direction to go?
Oh, I love this question, Nicole. And I have two answers to this. First, I think it's really important to just pause for a moment and reflect, right? Why am I doing this? Is it because I truly feel called to, because my heart is telling me to, right? This is fulfilling me in some way? Or is this coming from fear? Is this coming from a fear that I'm not worthy or I have to prove something? If something's coming from a fear response, that is a clear indication
Yeah.
that you might not be wanting to do that, right? And one way to gauge that is when you start to think about this in terms of, oh, I should be doing that instead of I want to be doing that. Once we get into that should category, it's a moment to pause and
Yeah.
say, okay, what are my motives here? And is this truly aligned with who I am? Right. So taking that moment for yourself and asking these critical questions. The second thing I often advise people, and this is something I didn't know how to do until I went on this healing journey, is to listen to the wisdom of your body, right? So tune in. Again, take that moment to pause. What is your body telling you? Earlier, when I was like exhausted, as I said, I did not listen to my body.
Mhm.
And I would just keep pushing, 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 pushing to the point where I had a full breakdown at the end of that decade period. It took me over a year to recover, and I didn't even know that that could happen, and that happening to me was so scary because I thought I was just invincible up until that point. And it's because I didn't listen to any of those cues. And so one of the things I've learned from my teachers that I now coach others on is what is a whole body yes, right? And that means when is your head, your heart, and your gut all aligned? So think about a time where you really wanted to do something. Maybe it was a friend you wanted to see, or a trip you wanted to go on, or even a food you wanted to eat, right? Like, what did that feel like in your body, right? And take a note of that and then map that out. Now, as you're making decisions, if something doesn't feel like a whole body yes, then pause and just reflect, do I really want to do this, right? Or if your body is telling you you need to take a break, honor that.
Right.
Honor that because when we care for ourselves, that is not weakness. That is what allows us to create sustainable impact over the long term, right? So invest in that and listen to the wisdom of the body.
As you were talking, it seems to me that there is a measure of self awareness that we're talking about in all of this. And you gave some examples. And I think it's important for each of us to know how does that feel for us? How do we experience those feelings? Because I do think we have a tendency to default to certain things. So, like, you talked about things where you're not doing it for the right reasons. For me, it almost always falls under the frame of trying to prove myself.
Yep.
That's usually when things get heavy and hard, and I'm not coming from a good, healthy place. I'm trying to
Yes.
prove myself and to everyone else and all
Yes.
that. You talked about, knowing how it feels in your body. When something feels right for me, I feel excited, nervous. Like it's a
Mhm.
combination. It's never 100% excitement and it's never 100% nervousness, but it's a little bit of both and I feel it like in my stomach. When I push too far or when I'm doing things from an unhealthy place, I actually become completely disconnected from my body. I'm like not even in my body anymore. I'm
Yeah.
numb. And so those are like some clues for me. What I was thinking as you were talking is to you, the listener, what are your clues? How do
Mhm.
you know when your body is telling you something? How do you know when something feels authentically good and healthy and right? And when it doesn't, when you might be coming from a not so healthy place?
Yeah. And just one more note on that, Nicole, is like some people will say to me, well, I don't know. I don't have that awareness. And what I respond is it can take time to develop.
Yeah.
And so just taking the moment to pause for 5 minutes and to sit with yourself and to notice, you start to develop and hone in on that over time. You start to develop that awareness,
Hmm.
right? And so just look for those subtle cues, and then you'll be amazed that as you develop that, you can really tap into the wisdom of that, and that can guide good decision making.
Every January, women feel pressure to fix themselves, be smaller, be better, be disciplined. Why isn't more pleasure ever the goal? What if 2026 wasn't about shrinking your body, but expanding your pleasure? Because here's the truth, good sex doesn't just happen. Sex is a skill, and like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, and improved without shame, pressure, or awkward Googling. That's where Beducated comes in. They have 150 online courses on sex and intimacy designed for women who want more connection and, yes, more pleasure. You can start by taking their quiz, which gives you a personalized roadmap to sexual happiness, all in a safe, private space at your own pace. So this year, skip the bullshit resolutions. Click the link in show notes and kick off your pleasure journey by taking the quiz. Get your personalized roadmap to sexual happiness with Beducated. No one tells you that when you start a business, you suddenly have 47 new job descriptions. CEO, marketing department, tech support, logistics manager, therapist, mostly to yourself. When I started my business, every day came with a new decision that I had absolutely no idea how to make. And that's why having the right tools matters. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. It handles the heavy lifting, from inventory to payments to analytics, all in one place. So no need to duct tape together 5 different platforms. You can build your store with beautiful templates, use built-in AI tools to streamline product pages, and run email and social campaigns to get the word out. And if you get stuck, they have award-winning 24/7 customer support. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Go ahead and sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/TIWW. Again, that's shopify.com/TIWW.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Thank you for saying that, because I think it's important that we know that these things take time and that we give ourselves grace and that we be patient with ourselves. I often think like it took us however many years it took us to be this way. Thinking that transformation is going to happen in a 24-hour cycle seems fairly unrealistic. So that leads to my question of, when we talk about transformation or transition or recovery, from your experience, what are some of the ways that might show up? What are some of the things we might experience, like this few steps forward, few steps back? Talk to us about that period of time where you went from a moment where you feel like you failed to today.
Yeah. Well, it is not a linear process. And that is one of the things I really wanted to show in my book, that progress is not about point A to B to C. And there are many points in the journey where I took 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. And I think the key to all of this, and what I advocate the most, is being kind to ourselves.
Mhm.
Right? And that in that those moments, know exactly what you said, like change isn't going to happen overnight or in a week or sometimes even in a year, but it's allowing ourselves to continue growing. And when we have setbacks, to kind of like really take that moment to be kind to ourselves, and then to keep moving forward and to reflect. And one of the things that I actually have found the most helpful in my self-growth process is something called parts work, or internal family systems, right? And this is a framework that's based on the premise that we all have different parts of ourselves. So, Nicole, you might have the overachiever, the control freak,
I
the
might.
perfect, the perfectionist, the inner critic. You also might have parts that carry feelings that are really painful, like the part of you that feels rejected or abandoned or really lonely, right? And so the goal of this practice is to, rather than shame or banish each of these parts, to relate to them with love and compassion. and to see the roles that all of these parts are playing in our lives, whether, to protect us, to keep us safe, and so on. And so this is a practice that's been absolutely groundbreaking for me.
Hmm.
And what I learned through that process was when that inner critic comes up that's like, no, you failed or do better. Like, okay, this part is here to keep me safe, to
Yeah.
keep me from feeling like, I failed or rejected. And so thank you for playing that part, but I can show myself that love and care. Right. And so that is it's a beautiful practice to practice that self-compassion and just notice when these voices come up
Yeah.
can sometimes be, I don't want to say like toxic, but they're not necessarily healthy voices for us. And so just again, this comes back to building awareness and then treating ourselves with kindness. And that is really what's allowed me to like get through this healing journey.
So we recently recorded an episode with a woman who talked about this. It's like listening when parts speak, right?
Yes.
And it actually was perfectly aligned with my next question, which was knowing that you look to a lot of different modalities. That might be the answer to the question, but were there any that were really impactful or really surprising to you that were helpful, or any other modalities that might be of interest as any of us go through failure,
Yes.
challenge, transition, whatever we experience?
Yeah, I'll talk about a few, and the book was fun to write from that perspective because I literally went out and tried every modality I could find around the world, and I kind of put my CEO hat on. I had a whole spreadsheet of all the different things. If something didn't work, I'd quickly pivot and try something else, and so I got a good taste of many of these modalities. But I would say a couple of things. One, and this is less of a modality, but just a practice, and I've already been talking a lot about this, but it's the importance of pausing to feel. Right. And I think many of us, especially us overachievers, we get caught in our heads, in
Mhm.
our analytical brain. Right. But there is something that is so important about tapping into our feelings to process difficult emotions in particular. And for most of my life, as I said, I disconnected from my emotions to survive, to keep going. Right. But part of this failure that kind of forced me into my body, and that's the beauty of hitting rock bottom. I was forced to feel and to sit with that. And instead of like escaping, I just let myself feel sadness. I let myself feel heartbreak, right? I let myself feel the anger or the fear or whatever came up. And the thing about these difficult feelings is you can't think your way out of them. You can't work your way out of them. You have to just take that moment and really feel your way through it. And I think that happens both through pausing, but through the power of community as well. So whether that's your friends, therapists, healers I've worked with, they created a safe space for me to go there. And so that's something I value so much about my community. But when we have that safety, then we can allow ourselves to go there. One of my greatest teachers, she always said to me, are you willing to feel your heartbreak? And we live in a society that doesn't encourage that, right? We live in an escapist society. When
Mhm.
we feel painful things, we turn to social media or alcohol or working or whatever it might be because we don't want to deal with that, right? And
Right.
so what happens is when we suppress those emotions, they resurface more intensely
Mhm.
as anxiety, depression, or burnout. And that's why it's so important to just pause and sit with and be with our feelings. That's the first thing. Second, I talked about IFS actually on my website, which I know you'll direct people to. There's a free exercise I've developed that gives you a taste of parts work. So if you guys are interested, please download that. You could try that on yourself. Psychedelic journeys, we could talk about that, but that's been, an important part of my healing process. And
I'm
then,
wildly curious about that, by the way. That's coming up a lot in my, I feel like the universe is sending these messages. I'm curious about it, but I've also literally never done a drug in my
yeah.
entire life. So I'm
Yeah.
like,
So one of the turning points in my journey was learning about the science of trauma. And I came across a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which many of you are probably familiar with. And through that, I learned something really surprising. So for most of my life, I thought trauma is something that happened in the past. Just leave it in the past, right? I've got my life, I've got my career. Why deal with that? What the science shows is that trauma actually rewires your brain and your nervous system. So it's the way you bring that past into your present. and it affects every part of your life, right? And if you don't recognize it, then you can't appropriately deal with it.
Mhm.
And so I think this is something that was really valuable for me to understand. Okay, this is how I've been affected, by these things from my upbringing, and the way it was showing up in my life was just this sense of hypervigilance, right? Not feeling safe, the need to prove constantly. I think achievement itself can be a trauma response.
Mhm.
When we don't feel enough, then we need to do more and prove more constantly to feel like we are worthy of love. And another interesting about trauma is it's not stored in our thinking brains. It's stored in our limbic systems, the
Mhm.
part of our brains responsible for feeling and connecting, right? And so you can only process trauma at that level. And that's why modalities like parts work or IFS have been really helpful for me, because there's a somatic element to it and it really gets you kind of outside of your thinking brain.
Right.
So the same thing goes for psychedelic journeys. It kind of gets you kind of, again, into your body and into deeper levels of consciousness. For me particularly, MDMA was the psychedelic that helped me the most. And the studies on this have been just remarkable. So there have been phase 3 clinical trials showing the effects of MDMA on PTSD with veterans.
Mhm.
And in a guided setting with a therapist, within about 3 sessions, they're able to get many of these veterans off the PTSD scale, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
And so, for so many years, there's kind of been the sense that drugs are taboo and all of that, but the science is showing something very different and showing the power of these medicines for healing. And so that has been the medicine that has been most helpful for me. And what it's really done is just allow me to, again, safely process some very difficult emotions and to have compassion, like both for myself and for my family system,
Mhm.
and for others around me. And so I've been able to access those emotions, but be able to kind of see them through a different lens, almost holding myself through the process of that, and just being able to see myself in a different light, and
Yeah.
those experiences I did my first journey years ago, and that's really stayed with me on a day-to-day level.
So there, again, so many things that you said jumped out at me, but I think a lot of times when people think about going back to trauma or how you were raised or what you learned from your parents, there's this sense of like, oh, it's always your parents' fault. And what you said there, I think was so important is that it creates compassion over blame for ourselves and for the people involved. There is the opportunity, and you can go back and understand your experiences without putting
Yes.
blame on someone else. And in fact, I would imagine that that's an integral part of the process is moving through that. I also want to reiterate what you said. This is not my area of expertise, but every person who it is their area of expertise says the same thing. Undealt with trauma, pain, feelings get stored in our bodies and resurfaces in some way, and usually not in a way that we would want it. And then you said this earlier, and I want to talk about this a little bit. The power of community, it aligns with my experience. Every time I'm feeling guilt or shame or embarrassment, I have found that the best tactic for me is to put words on it, to share
Mhm.
the experience with somebody I trust, somebody I love. It takes
Yeah.
away its power. And we talked a little bit about social media and like it's easy to default to go there, but I haven't experienced community in the way that we're talking about it there. I've experienced it more, in close relationships. How important, how necessary is it that we connect with people in our hardest, darkest, most challenging times versus just when it's good and we have good news to share and everything is working?
Oh my gosh, I think it's so important. And it's exactly what you said, right? It's putting words to it. Because when we have that shame and we're not expressing it, it grows. And we bottle it up, it keeps growing and growing, right? And this is what you talked about in the power of community is one of the reasons I think chatbots can't replace humans, at least not in their current form,
Right.
because something called empathetic resonance. And it's when you are speaking to someone and it's a simple look on their face or a gesture or something that shows you they care and they are empathizing with you and they're seeing you. And that in and of itself is so healing.
Yeah.
One of the things I didn't mention earlier was after I read The Body Keeps the Score, I became so obsessed with it that I stalked the author, Bessel van der Kolk, until he agreed to become my therapist. And so I've had the great fortune of working with Bessel over the last couple of years. And as I was writing this book, I went back and I looked through dozens of our video therapies. It's horrifying, by the way. I do not suggest like watching your therapy videos, okay? Like it's not a fun experience, but for the process of, my writing, I had to do that. But what was really cool about it was I started to see what was happening over time, right? And this goes back to like, this doesn't happen overnight. This happens over time. But I would see how I'd express a difficult story and Bessel would just pause and take a deep breath, like, and it would force me to pause and take a deep breath and
Mhm.
to realize, oh, that was sad, right? Because typically I would just kind of power through it and move on to the next thing. But he created that space for me. And it wasn't just him, but other teachers as well. Just created that space for me to pause in that moment and to access some difficult emotions. And so I saw how this happened more and more over time. And then as time went on, I was able to go there on my own much more easily. Right. And so it's like, it's about healing happens together and it happens when we hold each other. It happens when we allow ourselves to be held,
Yeah.
right? And that comes down to vulnerability.
That aligns completely with my own experience, both with a therapist. Very glad those are not recorded that I can watch back. And, just in experiences, the amount of times somebody else has reacted to something that I said that I'm just like mowing through
Yeah.
and it forces me to go, you know what? That is bigger than I'm pretending it is. Okay. My last question is around this transition of your journey, at least to my understanding, from achievement to authenticity. Talk to us about where authenticity matters, especially like in our professional worlds. I think sometimes we're told, authentic at home is fine, but come polished and buttoned up to work. And I said that was going to be my last question, but it just triggered another one. So answer that. And then I'll ask my final one. I have a little fly going around. Anyway.
No worries. No, that's such a beautiful question. Yes, and I hear that a lot again in my leadership coaching. Well, what do emotions have to do with work, right? Like I can display my emotions at home, but in the work, it's a different thing. And I used to think that as a first time CEO, I thought I had to be so buttoned up and composed all the time, and I never showed people how I was actually feeling. But the work we were doing was inherently emotional and very challenging, as I said. So I remember when I lived in India, one day I was so overwhelmed, I started crying in a team meeting. And afterwards, I was mortified, just mortified. It was all men reporting to me at that time. But afterwards, my head of operations came to me and he said, "Thank you so much for being vulnerable. Because when you're vulnerable, it gives us permission to be vulnerable too." Right. And I really started to understand that leadership is not about being so composed. It's about authenticity, right? It's about that connection. And the more vulnerable we are, the more we can create safe spaces for our teams. So there's a lot of research now on this concept of psychological safety,
Mhm.
that's the number one most important determinant of the highest functioning teams. And that's the ability for people to show up as their full selves at work so that they can take risks, right, without fear of failure. And my question for folks is, well, how do you create psychological safety for others if you don't have it for yourself? And that's why this inner work is so, so important. And authenticity means it's not, some of what we've talked about, it's not just about successes or failures, but it's about living in alignment with our values and listening to who we are and being kind to ourselves. And the more we have that compassion for ourselves, by the way, the more we're able to extend it to others.
Right.
And so the way that shows up in my life now, even leading up to the launch of this book, of course, I want the book to be successful. And there's all these people whispering in my ear, like, got to make this a bestseller and do this and that and whatever. I remember kind of just feeling overwhelmed by that. And I'd already, really given my whole soul to this book. And so about a month before the book came out, a friend came out to Honolulu, where I live now, and we did a little ceremony. And I only had one copy of the book at that time. And I threw it in the ocean. And it was just this beautiful act of surrender, that I put my soul into this. And now I'm going to let the wave take this message to where it needs to go. And so it's kind of that balance between, having goals, but also surrendering, right? And not being so focused on the outcomes, but being focused on, I think, the impact instead. And so that's what's kind of allowed me to really step into my most authentic self.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, love the title of your book. It jumped out at me right away, like a wave we break. And as you were talking, we all break. This is not a gendered thing. It's a human thing. And
Mhm.
for anyone listening who might be in the crash or the break or the failure or the fear right now, what would be one last piece of advice or message to them before we wrap up?
That I think what I discovered in my process is our biggest breaking points become the most beautiful breakthroughs, right? And if we can ride the storm and treat ourselves with compassion through that process, you will find freedom on the other side of that. So that's what I would say.
Amazing. Jane, thank you. And listener, I can already report that Jane's book is a national bestseller, which is very exciting. Again, the book is Like a Wave We Break, available Amazon, wherever you buy books. Let's keep our local bookstores in business. And Jane mentioned this earlier, but her website has a resource. It's janemariechen.com. We will put all the links and all the ways to find and follow Jane in show notes. Jane, thank you for being our guest and for sharing your wisdom and your experience.
Thank you, Nicole. So great to be here.
My absolute pleasure. Okay, friend, like a wave, we ebb and we flow, we rise and we break, and we know that it all serves its purpose. And in the ebbs and the breaks, we can trust that the flow and the rise are coming. Because learning to trust that rhythm is the quiet kind of strength that doesn't always get celebrated, but it always transforms us. The world tells us to keep rising all the time, to hold it together, to power through, to stay strong no matter what. But maybe the real power lives in remembering that the breaking is sacred too, that falling apart can be its own kind of becoming. We don't just ride the waves, we are the waves. And the beauty isn't just in their power, it's in their rhythm, in knowing when to rise, when to rest, and when to begin again. Because confidence, authenticity, and leadership, none of it means never falling apart. It means trusting that we can and we will rise again. And all of that is woman's work.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
But I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.